The first thing every new ranger learns about the Appalachian backcountry isn't written in any handbook. It isn't painted on trailhead signs or mentioned during training. It's passed quietly from one veteran ranger to another after dark, when the station is almost empty and the radio has finally gone silent. They tell you that the mountains don't always give people back. Sometimes they keep hikers. Sometimes they keep hunters. And every now and then, they try to keep the ranger sent to find them. My name is Daniel Mercer, and for nearly 12 years I worked as a park ranger in one of the oldest protected sections of the Appalachian Mountains. Most of my job was exactly what you'd expect: helping lost tourists, clearing storm damage from trails, checking remote campsites, rescuing injured hikers before bad weather rolled in. But every ranger who stays long enough eventually gets assigned a search that doesn't make sense. Mine began on a freezing October evening just after sunset, when dispatch called to report that a solo backpacker named Ethan Cole had failed to reach his scheduled campground. His vehicle was still sitting in the trailhead parking lot, perfectly locked, with his wallet tucked inside the glove compartment. The strange part was that experienced hikers never left their identification behind, especially not Ethan. According to the registration records, he had completed dozens of difficult Appalachian trails over the past 5 years. He carried satellite maps, emergency supplies, and knew wilderness survival better than most seasonal rangers. If someone like Ethan disappeared, it usually meant something had gone terribly wrong. By the time I reached Ranger Station 9, heavy fog had already swallowed the valleys below the ridgeline. The old station itself looked forgotten by time, its wooden walls stained almost black from decades of rain and mountain winters. My partner for the search, Ranger Tom Wallace, stood beside the equipment truck loading medical packs without saying a word. Tom had spent over 25 years in these mountains, and nothing seemed capable of rattling him. Yet that evening his hands moved slower than usual. Before climbing into the truck, he looked toward the dark forest stretching beyond the station and quietly asked, "Did dispatch tell you which trail?" I checked the clipboard. "Hollow Creek Trail." The moment I spoke the name, Tom stopped moving. His expression changed in a way I'd never seen before. It wasn't fear exactly. It looked more like disappointment, as if he already knew how the night would end. "That trail should have been closed years ago," he muttered. I asked why, but he simply climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. During the hour-long drive, rain began tapping against the windshield while dense Appalachian forest pressed tightly against both sides of the narrow mountain road. The headlights barely cut through the mist. Every few minutes, the radio crackled with bursts of static so loud they drowned out the engine. Dispatch tried calling twice, but only fragments reached us before disappearing beneath waves of interference. Tom turned the volume completely off. "No point," he said. "The radio always dies once we get close." I laughed, assuming he was joking. He wasn't. We reached the deserted trailhead just before 9 o'clock. Ethan's grey pickup sat exactly where dispatch described.
Прошло всего пару лет. Преданность. Это чувство знакомо немногим, но их невозможно больше сломать. Ничем.
That meant he had entered the forest exactly as planned. We photographed the vehicle, logged the location, and started down the Hollow Creek Trail. Within minutes, the sounds of civilization disappeared behind us. No highway noise, no distant aircraft. Even the usual chorus of crickets had vanished. The silence felt unnatural, almost heavy, broken only by our boots crushing wet leaves. About half a mile in, my flashlight swept across something hanging from a tree branch. At first I thought it was camping gear. Then the beam settled on faded orange survey ribbon, tied into dozens of tight knots. Fresh ribbon had been wrapped over old ribbon again and again, until the branch sagged under its weight. Every strip fluttered despite the complete lack of wind. "Who put these here?" I asked. Tom didn't stop walking. "Rangers. Why so many?" His answer came after several long seconds. Because they keep disappearing. I frowned, thinking he meant storms tore them down. Before I could ask another question, we rounded a bend and discovered the first footprint. It belonged to a heavy hiking boot matching Ethan's size. Relief washed over me until I noticed something impossible. Every footprint pointed toward us instead of away. It looked as though Ethan had walked backward for nearly 50 feet along the muddy trail without leaving a single forward-facing print. I knelt beside the tracks, checking for signs someone had altered them, but the impressions were perfect. Deep heel marks, toe grooves, natural stride spacing. The only thing wrong was the direction.
У всех друзей полно.
My pulse
А я
quivered
шо?
as Tom whispered,
Я-
"Don't follow me."
А, на, долбоёб ебаный. Все, что я делаю, моя жизнь.
He shook
Я
his head.
клоун. Я клоун. Вся моя жизнь заключается в том, чтобы моему зрителю было весело и интересно на моих трансляциях. Чтобы он меня обсуждал. Чтобы я был в центре внимания. А вам нравится то, что в нижней левой нижней части экрана? Вам нравится то, что там находится? Так, чисто интересно спросить.
Longer distance, dragging through the trees like rusted steel scraping against concrete. It echoed across the valley before fading into the thick Appalachian fog, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt as though the entire forest had stopped breathing. I raised my flashlight toward the ridgeline, expecting to see the outline of an abandoned fire tower, but there was nothing except endless black pines disappearing into the mist. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Tom didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed somewhere beyond the tree line. Finally, he nodded once. "It's closer than it should be." That wasn't the answer I wanted. We continued along Hollow Creek Trail, following the map even though the trail beneath our boots no longer matched it. The bends were wrong. The creek marked on my GPS had vanished. According to the coordinates, we should have crossed 2 wooden bridges already, yet neither existed. Every few minutes, my GPS screen blinked, the location jumping several miles in random directions before freezing altogether. Then the batteries died, even though I had installed fresh ones an hour earlier. As I reached for a spare set, my flashlight caught something nailed to an old oak tree. It was a weathered wooden sign, almost hidden beneath moss. The faded lettering simply read, "Ranger Station 14, 0.8 miles. I stared at it in confusion. "Station 14?" I asked. "There isn't a Station 14. Tom's face turned pale. "There used to be." Before I could ask what he meant, we noticed another trail branching away from Hollow Creek. It wasn't marked on any map, yet the ground showed recent footprints leading toward it. Heavy hiking boots, the exact same tread pattern as Ethan's. We followed carefully, calling his name every few minutes, but the forest swallowed our voices before they traveled 20 feet. After nearly half a mile, the trees suddenly opened into a small clearing. Standing in the center was an old wooden ranger cabin leaning slightly to one side. Its roof had partially collapsed years ago, and vines covered most of the walls. The windows were black, reflecting nothing. The strange metallic screech stopped the instant we stepped into the clearing. Everything became unnaturally still. Even the fog seemed frozen. Tom grabbed my arm before I reached the porch. "Look at the dust," he whispered. I aimed my light downward. Every inch of the porch was coated in thick grey dust, except for one set of fresh boot prints leading inside. None came back out. We exchanged nervous glances before slowly entering the cabin. The smell hit first. Wet wood, mildew, and something faintly metallic. Our lights swept across broken furniture, collapsed shelves, and old ranger equipment scattered across the floor. On one wall hung a faded map dated 1978. Another wall displayed missing person posters so old the paper crumbled at the edges. Then my light stopped on a ranger logbook lying open across a desk. The final handwritten entry read, "If anyone finds this station, leave immediately. The trail behind the cabin does not return to the same mountain. The page ended there, the pen stroke dragging sharply off the paper, as though the writer had been interrupted. A sudden knock echoed from somewhere beneath the floorboards. One slow knock, then another, then a third. Tom backed away instantly, his voice barely audible. "We're leaving. Now." As we turned toward the door, every radio on our belts exploded with deafening static. Through the noise, a calm male voice repeated the same sentence over and over. "Ranger Mercer, we found Ethan." My heart jumped. "Where is he?" The voice paused for several seconds before answering. "He's standing behind you." I spun around so fast my flashlight slipped from my hand. Its beam rolled across the floor, stopping beneath the broken staircase. For only a heartbeat, the light revealed a pair of muddy hiking boots standing perfectly still in the darkness. Above them, something impossibly tall remained hidden beyond the edge of the beam. Before I could raise the flashlight again, the batteries died all at once, and the entire cabin fell into absolute darkness. The last thing I heard before Tom dragged me outside was the unmistakable sound of slow, deliberate footsteps following us. But there were only 2 sets of footprints in the fresh mud when we reached the trail. Oi, Story 2. Every park ranger has a list of places they refuse to patrol after sunset. Not because those places are officially dangerous, but because nothing that happens there can ever be explained. Mine was a forgotten stretch of the Appalachian wilderness, known as Black Briar Trail. It disappeared from tourist maps years ago. The signs leading to it were quietly removed, and the public was told the trail had become unsafe after severe storm damage. That explanation kept curious hikers away, but every ranger stationed in our district knew the truth was far stranger. For decades, reports from Blackbriar Trail never made sense. Compasses spun in perfect circles without warning. GPS units showed impossible locations hundreds of miles away. Emergency radios received replies from ranger stations that had been demolished decades earlier. Experienced hikers claimed they heard family members calling their names from deep inside the forest, only to discover they had wandered miles off the trail while chasing voices that couldn't possibly have been there. Most of those reports were quietly buried in filing cabinets and dismissed as exhaustion, panic, or mountain folklore. I believed those explanations too, until the night dispatch handed me a case that nobody else wanted. It was late November, and freezing rain pounded against the roof of Ranger Station 7 when an emergency call came in from a terrified couple who had been camping nearly 4 miles inside Blackbriar Trail. According to them, shortly after midnight, someone began walking slow circles around their tent. They never saw a flashlight, never heard breathing, and never caught a glimpse of anyone outside. They only heard steady footsteps crunching through wet leaves, circling them again and again for nearly an hour. Every time the husband unzipped the tent and pointed his flashlight into the darkness, the footsteps stopped instantly. The moment he zipped it shut, they started again, always at the same slow pace, always just beyond the thin fabric walls. When daylight finally arrived, they packed their equipment in complete panic, but during the chaos they lost their 12-year-old Labrador, Rusty. They said the dog refused to leave the campsite. Instead, it sat perfectly still, staring into the forest with its ears pressed back, growling at something they couldn't see. Without warning, Rusty sprinted into the trees and vanished. 20 minutes after the couple reached safety, another call came from an old volunteer fire lookout station several miles away. He reported seeing a bright white flashlight moving through Blackbriar Trail long after the campers had already left the area. Whoever carried the light ignored repeated radio calls, never answered vehicle sirens, and somehow crossed sections of forest where no trail had existed for years. My supervisor slid the report across the desk and simply said, "Go verify it's another lost camper, then leave before midnight." I asked him why midnight mattered. He stared at me for several uncomfortable seconds before quietly replying, "Because that's when the radio starts answering itself." Nobody in the station smiled. By 8 that evening, I was driving an old park truck through freezing mountain rain with my partner, Ranger Ellie Brooks. Ellie had spent nearly 15 years working remote Appalachian districts, yet she almost never spoke about her experiences. When I asked if she'd ever patrolled Black Briar before, she answered without taking her eyes off the forest outside the passenger window. Twice. I asked what happened. I came back, she replied, ending the conversation. The trailhead looked abandoned. Rusted guardrails disappeared beneath vines. The parking lot was completely empty, and the old information board had rotted away until only one faded warning remained nailed to the wood. Authorized personnel only after dusk. No explanation, no agency seal, just those words. The moment we stepped beneath the first line of trees, something impossible happened. The rain stopped completely. Behind us, heavy rain continued crashing onto the parking lot, yet inside the forest the air was perfectly dry, as though an invisible wall separated the storm from the woods. I turned back twice, just to convince myself I wasn't imagining it. A curtain of rain hung only a few feet behind us while complete silence waited ahead. Neither of us mentioned it. 30 minutes later, we reached the abandoned campsite. The couple had fled so quickly that sleeping bags, cooking pans, unopened food, and scattered clothing still lay exactly where they had been left. Then Ellie aimed her flashlight toward the muddy ground surrounding the tent. Dog tracks covered the entire campsite. At first glance, it looked as though dozens of animals had wandered through after the campers left, but the longer I stared, the more wrong they became. Every paw print was identical. Same size, same depth, same spacing. They formed perfect circles around the tent, looping over themselves dozens of times with unnatural precision, as though one single dog had walked the exact same path for hours without ever making a mistake. In the very center of those circles rested Rusty's bright red collar. It was still buckled. It hadn't snapped or broken. Something had carefully removed it. Before either of us could examine it, a deep bark echoed through the trees somewhere far beyond the campsite. It sounded exactly like a Labrador. Familiar. Ordinary. Yet it came from far deeper inside the mountain than any lost dog could have reached in such a short time. Ellie immediately switched off her flashlight. I whispered, "Why did you do that?" Her voice was barely audible. "Because if that's really Rusty..." She never finished the sentence. The bark came again, much closer this time. Then, from somewhere directly behind us, where the trail had been completely empty only seconds earlier, a calm man's voice drifted through the darkness and quietly said, "Rangers, I found your dog." Neither of us moved after the voice faded into the darkness. The forest became so silent that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding inside my ears. Ellie slowly raised one finger to her lips, warning me not to answer, while her other hand drifted toward the emergency flare attached to her belt. Every instinct told me there was someone standing only a few yards behind us. Yet when I forced myself to turn around, my flashlight revealed nothing except towering hemlock trees, dense rhododendron thickets, and an empty trail disappearing into blackness. "Did you see it, Brian?" I whispered. Ellie didn't answer. Instead, she stared at the muddy ground. I followed her gaze and immediately felt my stomach tighten. A fresh set of boot prints had appeared behind us. They hadn't been there a few seconds earlier. The prints emerged from the forest, stopped less than 6 feet from where we were standing, then simply ended. There were no return tracks, no signs of someone stepping sideways into the bushes, nothing. It looked as though whoever made them had simply vanished into thin air. Before we could examine them any closer, the park radio clipped to my shoulder crackled violently. Through a wall of static came dispatcher's voice. "Ranger Brooks, Ranger Mercer, report your location." I reached for the microphone, relieved to hear another human voice. but Ellie grabbed my wrist before I could answer. "Listen carefully," she whispered. The voice repeated the message, but this time I noticed something wrong. Dispatch never used our last names over the radio during field operations. They always called us by our unit numbers. The transmission continued anyway, each repetition sounding slightly different, as though someone was learning how to imitate the dispatcher one sentence at a time. Then it laughed. Just once, quietly. The radio went dead. Ellie pulled the batteries out immediately and threw them into the mud. "That wasn't dispatch," she said. "Then who was it?" She looked toward the dark trees without replying. We decided to leave the campsite immediately, but after walking for nearly 20 minutes, we found ourselves standing in the exact same clearing. The abandoned tent, the scattered equipment, Rusty's red collar lying exactly where we'd left it. We tried again, choosing a different direction through the woods instead of following the trail. 25 minutes later, we emerged beside the same tent for a second time. My breathing became heavier. "This isn't possible." Ellie nodded slowly. "Now you understand why they closed Black Briar." The air suddenly filled with the smell of wet dog, strong enough to make my eyes water. Branches snapped somewhere behind us, followed by slow panting that circled just beyond the reach of our light. Whatever was moving stayed perfectly hidden, pacing around the campsite exactly as the terrified couple had described. One complete circle, then another, then another. I counted 12 slow laps before the footsteps finally stopped. Silence returned for only a moment. Then Rusty's bark echoed again. Except this time, it came from inside the abandoned tent. We both froze. The zipper, which had been fully closed when we arrived, slowly slid downward by itself with a long metallic hiss. Inch by inch, the opening widened until the inside of the tent became visible. My flashlight illuminated an empty sleeping bag, a dent in the ground where something very large had been lying, and fresh, muddy paw prints leading deeper inside, even though there wasn't enough space for any animal to fit. Then a human hand slowly emerged through the opening and rested on the wet ground. Pale, motionless, covered in mud. Before I could react, the hand began dragging itself forward, followed by an arm that bent at impossible angles, as though every bone inside it had been broken and healed the wrong way. A second hand appeared, then another. Story 3. People think the most dangerous part of being an Appalachian Park Ranger is the wildlife. Black bears, mountain lions, venomous snakes, sudden cliffs, flash floods. Those are the things visitors worry about. They can all kill you, but at least they follow the rules of nature. What frightened every veteran ranger I ever worked with was something that didn't. It was a trail that appeared only after heavy fog settled over the mountains. A trail that wasn't printed on any government map, wasn't marked by any official sign, and somehow managed to disappear before sunrise. Around the station, nobody called it by its real name anymore. They simply referred to it as the last mile, because every person who willingly walked that final mile either vanished forever or came back so different that they resigned within days and refused to explain why. I didn't believe any of those stories until the first week of December, when dispatch received an emergency distress signal from the deepest section of the Appalachian backcountry. The signal came from Ranger Caleb Harris, a veteran with nearly 18 years of experience who knew every trail, creek, ridge, and valley better than anyone else in the district. His message lasted only 9 seconds before dissolving into violent static. Unit 12. I found the missing hikers. Don't let anyone follow the... Then silence. We tried raising him every few minutes for the next 2 hours, but the only response was an endless burst of static mixed with what sounded like distant footsteps crunching across frozen leaves. Since Caleb's GPS beacon continued transmitting from the same location, my supervisor assembled a small search team before nightfall. There were only 3 of us, me, Ranger Olivia Grant, and volunteer tracker Mason Reed. The drive into the mountains took nearly 90 minutes through freezing rain and thick fog that swallowed our headlights before they reached the next bend in the road. None of us spoke much. Every ranger in the truck knew Caleb wasn't the kind of man who got lost. If he had called for help, something had gone terribly wrong. We reached the trailhead shortly after 8 that evening. Caleb's patrol vehicle sat exactly where it should have been, parked neatly beside the gate with the engine cold and the driver's door locked. His rifle remained secured inside the rack. His backpack was missing. Fresh boot prints led away from the truck toward a narrow trail, disappearing into dense white fog. We followed immediately. Less than 15 minutes later, something unusual caught Olivia's attention. Every tree along the trail had a small red ribbon tied around its trunk at shoulder height. At first, I assumed another ranger had marked the route for search teams, but when I touched one of the ribbons, the fabric crumbled into dust between my fingers, as though it had been hanging there for decades. The next ribbon looked brand new. Then another turned to dust. New, old, new, old. The strange pattern continued for nearly half a mile, as though time itself couldn't decide how long the markers had existed. Mason quietly muttered, "Something's wrong with this place." None of us argued. A few minutes later, we discovered Caleb's first clue. His flashlight lay in the middle of the trail, still switched on, its beam cutting through the fog. The batteries should have died hours earlier, yet the light burned with full brightness. Nearby, we found his radio. It was badly scratched, but otherwise undamaged. The speaker suddenly crackled to life by itself. Through the static came Caleb's exhausted voice. "If you're hearing this, turn around. It's already behind you." We spun around instantly. The trail behind us was empty. Nothing moved. No animals, no people. Only fog drifting silently between ancient pine trees. Mason laughed nervously, trying to convince himself someone was playing a cruel joke. Then we noticed something that made every one of us stop breathing. There were 4 sets of footprints in the fresh mud. Mine, Olivia's, Mason's, and another set that had been walking directly behind us since we entered the forest. None of us had ever heard a single footstep. For several long seconds, none of us dared to move. My flashlight remained fixed on the 4th trail of footprints cutting through the mud behind ours. They were fresh. So fresh that rainwater had not yet settled inside them, yet none of us had heard another person following us. Mason slowly counted the tracks under his breath, hoping he'd made a mistake. But every few feet, the pattern repeated itself. 3 sets of ranger boots, and a 4th pair matching our pace exactly. Never getting closer, never falling behind. Olivia whispered, "Don't turn around again." I asked why. Her face had lost all color. "Because if those prints are real," she said quietly, "then whoever made them isn't walking anymore." Before I could ask what she meant, Caleb's radio crackled once more. This time there was no static, only heavy breathing. Then Caleb's voice returned, trembling with fear, unlike anything I'd ever heard from him. "It copies the last person who looks at it." The transmission ended with a loud metallic bang, followed by silence. We pushed deeper into the forest, determined to find Caleb before the trail vanished into the fog completely. The trees became older and larger, until their branches blocked almost every trace of moonlight. Thick moss covered the ground, muffling our footsteps, and the cold grew so intense that every breath formed white clouds in front of our faces. About 20 minutes later, we found Caleb's backpack hanging from the branch of a dead oak nearly 15 feet above the ground. There were no broken limbs, no climbing marks, and no signs that anyone had thrown it. It simply hung there, swaying gently despite the still air. Inside were untouched emergency supplies, spare batteries, and Caleb's notebook. The final page contained only one sentence, written over and over in increasingly shaky handwriting. Don't follow the whistling. The last few words trailed into a jagged line, as though the pen had been ripped from his hand. Almost on cue, a faint whistle floated through the fog ahead of us. It sounded like someone casually calling for a lost dog, soft and almost cheerful. Mason instinctively took a step toward it before Olivia grabbed his shoulder hard enough to spin him around. "Ignore it!" she snapped. The whistle came again, this time from somewhere behind us, then from our left, then from directly above the trees. It wasn't echoing. It was moving, faster than anything should have been able to move through the forest. We hurried downhill until the fog suddenly thinned, revealing a small clearing that none of us remembered seeing on the map. In its center stood an abandoned wooden fire watchtower, leaning dangerously to one side. Every window was shattered. Every stair had collapsed years ago. Yet a single lantern burned steadily inside the observation room at the top. Someone was there. A dark figure stood perfectly still behind the glass, watching us. I raised my binoculars, expecting to see Caleb signaling for help. Instead, I saw a park ranger wearing an old uniform that hadn't been used in decades. The name tag was too damaged to read, but the face beneath the hat was completely featureless, smooth like weathered stone. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just pale skin beneath the brim. Then it slowly lifted one gloved hand and pointed behind us. We turned instinctively. Caleb Harris stood less than 20 feet away between two pine trees. He looked exhausted, covered in mud, and desperately waved for us to come toward him. Relief flooded through me until Olivia whispered, "Don't move." I looked back toward the tower. The faceless ranger was still pointing at Caleb. Then I noticed something impossible. Caleb wasn't leaving footprints. The muddy ground beneath him remained perfectly untouched. My heart began pounding as he smiled and called my name in a calm, familiar voice. "You made it. I've been waiting." At that exact moment, the real Caleb's radio, still hanging from my backpack, came alive one final time. Through broken static, his weak voice whispered, "If you can see me, that's not me." The smiling figure between the trees tilted its head unnaturally, the grin stretching wider than any human face should allow. Then, from every direction in the forest, dozens of identical voices all spoke at once, each one sounding exactly like Caleb, exactly like Olivia, and exactly like me. Only one of us gets to leave the mountain tonight. Story 4. The oldest search and rescue in the Appalachian Mountains has nothing to do with survival gear, weather, or wild animals. It's a rule so strange that every rookie laughs the first time they hear it. If you ever find a campsite that looks perfectly untouched after 3 days of bad weather, leave immediately. I thought it was just another piece of mountain folklore until one bitter January afternoon, when dispatch received a report from a pair of snowmobilers who had spotted smoke rising from a remote valley where camping had been prohibited for over 20 years. Satellite images showed nothing unusual: no cabins, no active campsites, no structures of any kind. Still, someone had clearly seen smoke drifting above the trees. Because winter storms were moving in, my supervisor sent only 2 of us to investigate: me and Ranger Nathan Cross, a quiet veteran who had spent almost 3 decades patrolling the Appalachian backcountry. During the drive, he said almost nothing except one sentence that stayed with me the entire night. "If we find a fire, don't try to warm yourself." I laughed, assuming he was joking, but Nathan never smiled. By the time we reached the abandoned trailhead, heavy snow had buried almost every sign of civilization. The parking lot was empty, except for a rusted maintenance truck that records claimed had been removed 15 years earlier. Its windows were coated with ice from the inside, and the driver's door hung slightly open, even though the lock remained engaged. We left it alone and followed the faint column of smoke rising through the pine forest. The deeper we walked, the stranger the mountain became. Snow covered everything except a narrow strip of ground directly ahead of us. It looked as though someone had swept the trail clean with impossible precision, leaving a winding path of bare earth through the middle of a frozen wilderness. There were no footprints on it. Not human. Not animal. Nothing. Nathan refused to step onto the exposed soil and motioned for me to stay in the snow beside it. When I asked why, he quietly answered, "Because if something walks here, it doesn't leave tracks." Nearly an hour later, the trees opened into a small clearing, and every hair on my arm stood up at once. Sitting in the center was a campsite that looked as though its owners had walked away only minutes earlier. A bright orange tent stood perfectly upright, without a single snowflake resting on its roof. A cast-iron pot hung above a crackling campfire. 2 steaming metal cups sat beside neatly folded blankets. Fresh bread rested on a wooden plate, and the smell of hot coffee drifted through the icy air. It looked warm, inviting, impossibly alive in the middle of a valley that should have been buried beneath several feet of snow. Yet the forest surrounding it remained completely silent. No birds, no wind, no sound except the gentle crackling of burning wood. Nathan immediately stopped walking. "Don't touch anything," he whispered. "Someone could still be here," I replied. "Exactly," he said. We called out several times, identifying ourselves as park rangers, but nobody answered. I noticed something odd about the fire. The flames burned a deep blue instead of orange, and despite standing only a few feet away, I couldn't feel even the slightest trace of heat. Curious, I reached out with a gloved hand. Nathan grabbed my arm so violently that he nearly knocked me to the ground. Before he could explain, a sharp whistle echoed somewhere beyond the trees. Then another answered from the opposite side of the clearing. Then another. Within seconds, the entire forest was filled with slow, deliberate whistles circling the campsite from every direction. Nathan's face turned pale. "We're too late," he whispered. "For what?" He pointed toward the untouched snow surrounding the campfire. I followed his finger and realized why the campsite had looked so perfect. There were no footprints leading into it. There were no footprints leading away from it. The tent, the chairs, the fire, the food, everything had somehow appeared in the middle of the clearing without anyone ever walking there. Then the zipper of the tent slowly began to slide open from the inside, even though neither of us had seen anyone enter it. Neither of us breathed as the zipper continued sliding downward with slow, deliberate precision, the tiny metal teeth separating one by one until the tent stood half open. The whistles stopped all at once. The silence that followed felt heavier than the mountain itself. Nathan quietly raised his rifle, but he wasn't aiming at the tent. He was aiming at the dark tree line behind it. "Don't look inside," he whispered. "Why?" I asked. His answer came almost too quietly to hear. "Because if it's empty, we run." Every instinct told me to ignore him, yet curiosity won. I swept my flashlight through the opening. The tent was spotless. 2 sleeping bags lay neatly zipped. A lantern glowed softly in one corner. A deck of playing cards rested beside a half-finished game. Steam still rose from a tin cup of coffee. It looked exactly as if 2 campers had stepped outside only seconds ago. But there was no one inside. Not even footprints in the fabric floor. Then something tapped the back of my boot. I spun around expecting an animal, but there was nothing there. A second tap struck my other heel. Nathan's eyes widened with terror. "Don't move," he whispered. I looked down. Fresh footprints were appearing in the snow around us, one after another. as though an invisible person was slowly walking circles around where we stood. The snow compressed beneath unseen boots, each print forming with a soft crunch that echoed through the clearing. We watched in horror as the circle grew tighter. 20 feet away. 15. 10. 8. Whatever was making them never became visible. Only the footprints. Then the campfire suddenly flared bright blue, sending sparks high into the frozen air. For a brief second, the flames illuminated dozens of figures standing silently between the trees. Men, women, children, all dressed in old hiking clothes from different decades. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their eyes reflecting the strange blue firelight. None of them moved. None of them blinked. They simply watched us. I rubbed my eyes, and they were gone. The fire returned to its normal size, as if nothing had happened. Nathan slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out an old folded photograph. He handed it to me, without taking his eyes off the forest. The faded picture showed the exact same campsite, the exact same tent, the exact same campfire, surrounded by 5 smiling park rangers. On the back, someone had written a date from 32 years earlier. Beneath it were 4 words. Never found after this. My stomach turned cold. Those rangers had disappeared decades before I was even born. Before I could speak, a voice drifted from inside the tent. It was calm, familiar. "Nathan, you can stop searching now." Nathan staggered backward as though he'd been punched. His hands began shaking uncontrollably. "That's impossible," he whispered. "Who's speaking?" I asked. His face drained of all color. My brother. He had told me years earlier that his younger brother, also a park ranger, had vanished on patrol in these mountains 27 years ago. The voice came again, gentle and warm. "I've been waiting for you. Come inside. It's warm." Nathan took one slow step toward the tent before I grabbed his jacket. He resisted for only a second, then suddenly stopped as if waking from a dream. At that exact moment, the whistles returned, louder than before, circling the clearing with impossible speed. The invisible footprints stopped forming. Instead, every print already surrounding us began filling with dark liquid that looked almost black against the snow. The smell of smoke disappeared, replaced by the sickly odor of damp earth and something long dead. The blue fire went out without warning. Total darkness swallowed the clearing. Only our flashlights remained. Their beams swept across the campsite and froze. The tent was gone. The chairs were gone. The food, the blankets, the campfire. Everything had vanished as though it had never existed. Only one thing remained in the middle of the snow. 5 weathered park ranger badges arranged in a perfect circle. Nathan slowly knelt and picked one up. The metal was frozen solid, despite having been beside a burning fire only seconds earlier. He turned it over, and I saw fresh scratches carved into the back. There were 5 names, and beneath them, a 6th line that looked as though it had been etched only moments ago. It wasn't Nathan's name. It wasn't mine. It simply read, "Search team arrived. 2 more badges needed." Then, somewhere behind us in the darkness, I heard the unmistakable sound of a zipper being pulled closed, very slowly, even though the tent no longer existed. Story 5. Most visitors believe the Appalachian Mountains become quiet after sunset. They're wrong. The forest is always talking. Wind moves through the pines, streams rush over stone, owls call from the ridges, and branches creak in the cold. As a park ranger, you learn those sounds until they become second nature. That's why one particular patrol still keeps me awake years later, because for nearly 3 hours, the forest made no sound at all. Not one. It began in early March after an unusually warm week melted most of the mountain snow. A group of college hikers reported finding an abandoned observation platform overlooking a deep valley that wasn't marked on any trail map. They claimed someone had painted a warning across the wooden railing in large white letters. If the forest goes silent, don't look down. Thinking it was nothing more than vandalism, they ignored it, took a few photographs, and continued hiking. Less than an hour later, one member of the group disappeared without a scream, without a struggle, and without leaving so much as a broken branch behind. Search teams combed the area until nightfall, but found only the missing hiker's backpack standing upright against a tree, completely dry, despite hours of rain. The next morning, I was assigned to continue the search with Senior Ranger Emily Carter, a woman who had spent nearly 20 years working the most remote sections of the Appalachian backcountry. During the drive, she unfolded an old district map that looked older than both of us combined. Near the edge of the paper, hidden beneath several pencil markings, was a tiny handwritten note that simply read, "Observation platform removed, 1984. I asked why it was still appearing if it had been demolished decades earlier. Emily stared out the windshield for several seconds before quietly saying, "Because some places don't realize they've been abandoned." We reached the trail shortly before sunset. The weather was calm, yet the deeper we hiked, the stranger everything felt. Birds stopped singing one by one. The constant trickle of nearby creeks faded until even the rushing water seemed to disappear. Soon the only sounds left were our own footsteps. Then those vanished too. I could see my boots crushing leaves and snapping twigs beneath them, but no noise reached my ears. It was as though someone had switched the entire forest off. Emily immediately froze. "It started," she whispered, though I couldn't actually hear her voice. Her lips moved, but the words reached me only as a faint vibration inside my head. Panic slowly settled into my chest. I shouted her name, but my own voice never left my mouth. We hurried forward until the trees suddenly opened onto a weathered wooden observation platform extending over the edge of a steep cliff. It looked impossibly old, yet every board appeared freshly swept. There wasn't a single leaf resting on it. The white warning painted across the railing was exactly as the hikers had described. If the forest goes silent, don't look down. Someone had tried scratching the message away years earlier, but the words had somehow bled back through the wood. We searched the platform for signs of the missing hiker and quickly found a cracked camera lying near the edge. The memory card was still inside. I powered it on and opened the final photograph. It showed the exact same platform from only a day earlier, with the missing student smiling beside the railing. Behind him stood the rest of his hiking group. I counted once, then again. There were supposed to be 6 hikers in the group. The photograph showed 7. The 7th person wasn't smiling. He wore an old Appalachian Park Ranger uniform, so faded it was nearly grey, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. Emily quietly took the camera from my hands before I could look any closer. Her eyes widened in horror. She slowly turned the screen toward me and pointed at the reflection in the camera lens. Standing directly behind us on the empty platform was that same ranger. My heart nearly stopped. I spun around so fast the camera slipped from my hands, crashing against the wooden planks. The platform behind us was empty. No ranger, no footsteps, no movement. Yet when I looked back at the camera's cracked screen, the figure was still standing there in the reflection, perfectly motionless, only a few feet behind where we had been. Emily snatched the camera and switched it off immediately. "Never use a lens here," she whispered. "It sees things before you do." Before I could ask what she meant, a sharp cracking sound echoed beneath the platform. It was the first real sound either of us had heard since entering the silent forest, and somehow it made the silence feel even worse. The old wooden structure trembled gently under our boots. Another crack followed, this time directly below us, as though someone, or something, was climbing the support beams from the darkness beneath the cliff. Instinctively, I stepped toward the railing to look over the edge. Emily grabbed my backpack so hard it nearly pulled me off my feet. "Don't!" she shouted. "Read the warning." I forced myself to look away from the drop and noticed something strange about the painted message. New words were slowly appearing beneath the old ones, as if invisible hands were writing across the weathered wood. "It knows when you're curious." The fresh letters glistened as though the paint had just been applied. Then they began dripping downward like wet blood before soaking into the wood and disappearing completely. The silence ended without warning. Birds exploded into frantic cries. Wind roared through the trees. Somewhere far below, water rushed violently against the rocks. Every sound returned at once, almost painfully loud. I sighed with relief, thinking whatever had happened was finally over. Emily didn't relax. She looked terrified. "It's listening now," she said. A distant whistle floated up from the valley below. Then another answered from somewhere behind us. Within seconds, dozens of whistles echoed through the forest, surrounding the platform from every direction. They weren't random. They formed a pattern, almost like people passing signals to one another. Then came the footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They approached along the empty trail we had just walked, but no one appeared between the trees. Only the sound of boots drawing closer. I raised my flashlight toward the trailhead and finally saw movement. A line of park rangers emerged from the forest, one behind another, all wearing uniforms from different decades. Some carried old lanterns instead of flashlights. Others wore rusted badges and hats covered in moss. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their eyes fixed straight ahead. None of them acknowledged us. They simply marched onto the observation platform in perfect silence. There must have been 20, maybe 30 of them. The wood never creaked beneath their weight. One by one they reached the railing, removed their ranger hats, and looked down into the valley. Every single one stood perfectly still, as though waiting for something. Emily whispered, "Don't join them, no matter what you hear." The ranger closest to me slowly turned his head. His face looked weathered, almost mummified, but I recognized the badge on his chest from old station photographs. He had disappeared during a search operation in 1976. His lips never moved, yet I heard his voice clearly beside my ear. "Just one look," he murmured. "You'll understand why none of us left." Before I could react, every ranger on the platform leaned forward at the exact same moment and stared over the edge. A low humming rose from somewhere deep inside the valley. The sound grew louder until the entire platform vibrated beneath our feet. Then, from far below, another voice drifted upward through the darkness. It wasn't calling my name. It was calling tomorrow's search team, reporting that Rangers Emily Carter and I had been found at the bottom of the cliff, nearly 12 hours before either of us had disappeared. At that instant, the camera line broken on the floor flickered back to life by itself. The cracked screen displayed a live image of the platform. I looked down, and my blood turned to ice. The platform in the video was empty. Completely empty. There were no rangers. There was no Emily. There wasn't even me. Only the old wooden railing, and 2 fresh park ranger hats lying neatly side by side where we were still standing. Story 6. Every Appalachian Park Ranger eventually hears about the old emergency phone, According to the official records, it never existed. There isn't a single maintenance log, installation report, or map showing its location. Yet every few years, usually after a violent thunderstorm, someone reports finding a weathered green emergency telephone standing beside an abandoned trail deep in the mountains. The strange part isn't that the phone appears, it's that it works. No power lines run to it. No underground cables have ever been found. Still, when someone picks up the receiver, they always hear a park ranger asking for help. By the time a rescue team reaches the location described during the call, the phone has vanished, and the ranger who supposedly made the distress call is either standing safely miles away or has been dead for decades. I dismissed those stories as mountain folklore until the middle of April, when dispatch received 3 separate 911 transfers within the same hour. Every caller reported hearing a phone ringing somewhere along Raven's Gap Trail. None of them answered it. All 3 immediately turned around and left the mountain, insisting the ringing continued to follow them until they reached the parking lot. My supervisor handed me the report without saying much. "Just check the trail," he muttered. "And if you hear a phone..." He stopped speaking before quietly adding, "Don't answer it." I laughed, expecting someone else to smile. Nobody did. By late afternoon, I was hiking Raven's Gap with Senior Ranger Lucas Bennett, a man who had spent nearly 30 years patrolling the Appalachian backcountry. Lucas carried more emergency gear than usual, including an old cassette recorder instead of a digital radio. I asked why he still used outdated equipment. "Because electronics lie up here," he replied without looking at me. "Tape usually doesn't." The trail began normally enough. Birds filled the trees, squirrels darted between fallen logs, and the distant sound of a creek echoed through the valley. Then, without warning, a telephone rang. It was faint at first, almost blending with the wind, but each ring became clearer than the last. It sounded close enough to touch, yet no matter how far we walked, the distance never changed. Lucas immediately stopped and pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. Across the top, someone had written a list of names, every one of them belonging to former Appalachian Park Rangers. Several names had been crossed out in red ink. One name remained uncrossed. Mine. Before I could ask what the list meant, the ringing stopped. A cold breeze drifted through the forest, carrying the unmistakable smell of old cigarette smoke. Even though smoking had been banned in the park for years, we rounded the next bend and froze. Standing beside the trail was an old green emergency telephone mounted on a wooden post. The paint had peeled away decades ago. Moss covered the lower half, and rust stained the metal base. There were no power lines, no utility poles, no sign that it had ever been connected to anything. Yet the receiver hung gently from its cord, swaying back and forth as though someone had just put it down. A small brass plaque was bolted beneath the phone. Most of the lettering had worn away, but one sentence remained perfectly readable. "Emergency calls only. They're already waiting." Lucas quietly backed away from the phone, refusing to take his eyes off it. "We're leaving," he whispered. Before either of us could move, the telephone rang again. Once, twice, 3 times. Then, without anyone touching it, the receiver slowly lifted off the hook by itself and began dangling in the cold mountain air. From the tiny speaker came a weak, desperate voice crackling through heavy static. "Ranger Bennett," it pleaded. "Please hurry. I found your partner." Lucas's face turned completely white. I had never met his former partner, but I knew enough park history to remember one detail. Ranger Michael Hayes had disappeared on Raven's Gap Trail 21 years earlier during a search operation. His body had never been found. Then the voice spoke again. This time, it sounded exactly like mine. "Lucas," it whispered. Don't let me answer the phone. Lucas grabbed my arm before I could take another step. His grip was so tight it hurt. Don't listen to it, he whispered, never taking his eyes off the dangling receiver. It doesn't need you to answer anymore. It already knows your voice. The receiver swung gently back and forth, although there wasn't the slightest breeze. Then the line filled with heavy breathing, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots crunching across wet leaves. They grew louder with every second, as if someone carrying the phone was slowly walking toward us from somewhere deep inside the forest. I looked around, expecting another ranger to emerge between the trees, but the trail remained empty. Suddenly, the cassette recorder clipped to Lucas's backpack clicked on by itself. The reels began spinning even though he hadn't pressed the play button. A distorted recording echoed from the tiny speaker. Search Team 4, arriving at Raven's Gap, 7:18 p.m. Lucas's eyes widened. That's impossible, he muttered. We haven't even checked in yet. The recording continued. At first, it sounded like a normal patrol log, but then it changed. My own voice came through the tape, screaming for help, followed by Lucas shouting my name over and over. The final words made my blood run cold. No survivors. Both rangers missing. The tape abruptly stopped. The timestamp printed on the cassette was tomorrow's date. Before either of us could process what we'd heard, the telephone rang again. This time it didn't stop after 3 rings. It continued endlessly, each shrill tone echoing through the valley until every bird fell silent. Then, all at once, every abandoned payphone, emergency call box, and radio speaker scattered throughout the forest began ringing with it. The sound came from every direction. We ran. The ringing followed. No matter how fast we moved, it stayed exactly the same distance behind us. After several minutes, we burst into a small clearing where an old ranger station stood hidden beneath vines and fallen branches. According to every map I'd ever seen, that station had burned to the ground in 1998. Yet there it was, untouched, with warm light glowing behind dusty windows. The front door stood open. Inside, dozens of telephones lined the walls. Green emergency phones, black rotary phones, modern desk phones. Even cracked cell phones hung from nails. Every single one was ringing. Hundreds of them. The noise was deafening. In the center of the room sat an elderly park ranger wearing a faded uniform covered in dust. He calmly wrote names into a thick leather logbook without looking up. As we backed toward the door, he spoke in a tired voice. "You're late," Lucas shouted. "Who are you?" The old ranger finally raised his head. His face was familiar from photographs hanging inside headquarters. It belonged to Harold Whitaker, the district supervisor who had vanished during a rescue mission in 1969. He smiled sadly. "I've been answering the phone for 57 years. He slowly turned the logbook toward us. Every page contained the name of a missing ranger. Some entries stretched back more than a century. At the very end of the final page, 2 blank lines waited. As we watched, invisible handwriting slowly carved itself into the paper. The first line filled with Lucas Bennett's name. The second filled with mine. Then every ringing phone stopped at exactly the same instant. The silence lasted only a heartbeat before one telephone in the far corner began ringing by itself. Unlike the others, it had no cord, no receiver, no wires at all. It simply rang. Harold stood up, stepped aside, and quietly said, "It's your call now." Before we could move, the cordless phone answered itself. A weak voice whispered through the empty room. It was my voice, but much older, trembling with exhaustion. "If you're hearing this, don't leave the station." I froze as the voice continued. Because the moment you walk outside, you'll realize you've been inside here for 23 years. At that instant, sunlight poured through the station windows. The forest outside was gone. In its place stood a modern search team staring at the ruined remains of the ranger station. One rescuer pointed toward two weathered skeletons still wearing faded park ranger uniforms. Rusted name tags clung to their chests. One read, Lucas Bennett. The other had my name on it. Story 7. There was one rule posted inside every Appalachian Ranger station that visitors were never allowed to see. It wasn't written in any training manual, and no supervisor ever explained where it came from. The laminated card simply read, if you ever find a trail marked with white lanterns instead of orange blazes, turn around immediately. Do not count the lanterns. Most new rangers assumed it was an old prank until the spring morning I received a missing person report involving 3 experienced backpackers who had vanished somewhere along Crow's Hollow Ridge. Their last text message reached dispatch at exactly 8:41 p.m. It contained only 7 words. We found the Lantern Trail. It's beautiful here. After that, every phone, GPS beacon, and emergency locator they carried went completely silent. 2 days later, I was assigned to lead a search with veteran ranger Sarah Whitmore, who had worked the Appalachian backcountry for more than 20 years. As we loaded supplies into the truck, I noticed she quietly removed every lantern from our emergency kit and replaced them with old-fashioned flashlights. When I asked why, she closed the equipment case and said, because the mountain likes lanterns better. That was all she would say. We reached Crow's Hollow shortly before sunset. The trailhead looked ordinary except for one strange detail. Every information sign had been freshly painted except a single weathered board tucked behind a fallen oak tree. Most of its lettering had faded away, but one sentence remained perfectly clear. The light ahead isn't yours. Sarah folded the map and slipped it into her pocket without looking at the sign. Stay on the orange blazes, she reminded me. If the markers change color, don't follow them. The first mile passed quietly. Birds called from the trees, squirrels darted through fallen leaves, and a cool breeze carried the scent of damp pine. Then the forest began changing in ways I couldn't explain. The orange trail blazes nailed to the trees became fewer and farther apart. In their place appeared old iron hooks driven into the bark, each one holding an antique white lantern. None of them contained fuel. None had candles inside. Yet every lantern glowed with a soft, pale light that somehow cast no shadows. I counted 3 before remembering the warning posted at the station and forced myself to stop. Sarah refused to even glance at them. Keep walking, she whispered. Pretend they aren't there. We followed the official trail another half mile until we discovered the first backpack lying neatly beside a tree. It belonged to one of the missing hikers. Nothing had been stolen. Food remained untouched. The water bottle was still full. The only unusual thing was the notebook tucked into the front pocket. Every page had been filled with the exact same sentence, written hundreds of times in increasingly shaky handwriting. The lanterns keep moving closer. As I closed the notebook, a faint, warm light appeared deeper between the trees. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, dozens of glowing white lanterns hung silently throughout the forest, stretching far beyond where my flashlight could reach. They hadn't been there moments earlier. None of them swayed in the wind. None flickered. They simply waited. Sarah immediately turned off her flashlight. "Don't let your light touch theirs," she whispered. Before I could ask what she meant, a soft voice drifted through the trees. It belonged to a young woman, frightened and exhausted. "Ranger, please help us." The voice sounded exactly like the missing hiker, whose photograph had been attached to our search file. Relief washed over me until Sarah grabbed my shoulder hard enough to stop me from taking another step. "Listen carefully," she said. "She's asking for help." Her grip tightened as the voice repeated the same sentence, with the exact same pause, in the exact same tone, over and over again. It wasn't calling to us. It was repeating a recording. Then every white lantern in the forest slowly turned toward us at the same time, as though invisible hands had lifted them from their hooks, and from somewhere far ahead, hidden beyond the endless lights, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone striking a match, followed by a single, whispered sentence that echoed through the trees. "You counted them. Now they can count you." The whisper faded, but the forest didn't. Every white lantern remained suspended between the trees, all of them, now facing in our direction. My flashlight suddenly felt useless. Its beam looked weak compared to the pale glow surrounding us. And the deeper I stared into those lights, the more they seemed to shift without actually moving. Sarah pulled me backward one slow step at a time. "Don't make eye contact with the lanterns," she whispered. "They don't need eyes to watch you." Before I could ask what she meant, one of the lanterns nearest the trail went dark. Then another. Then another. They weren't burning out. They were disappearing one by one, as though something unseen was carrying them closer through the forest. The spaces between us and the remaining lights became smaller with every passing second. A cold wind swept across the ridge, bringing with it the smell of melted wax and damp earth. Then I heard footsteps. Not one person. Many. Slow boots crunching through dead leaves, perfectly synchronized, circling somewhere beyond the trees. I swept my flashlight toward the sound and caught a glimpse of figures standing between the trunks. They carried white lanterns at chest height, but the light never reached their faces. All I could see were dark silhouettes wearing old hiking clothes, some dressed in uniforms so faded they looked like they belonged to another century. None of them walked. Yet every time I blinked, they were standing a few feet closer. Sarah reached into her jacket and removed a faded photograph sealed inside a plastic sleeve. She shoved it into my hands. It showed a search team from 1993 posing beside Crow's Hollow Ridge. 7 smiling rangers stood shoulder to shoulder. Every one of them had vanished during a rescue operation that same night. I looked closer and felt my stomach twist. Hanging in the trees behind the group were dozens of glowing white lanterns. The rangers had been smiling at the camera, but every lantern was pointed directly at them. A sharp crack echoed from somewhere above us. One of the old lanterns hanging over the trail suddenly fell to the ground without breaking. The glass remained perfectly intact. Its little metal door slowly creaked open by itself. Inside, instead of a candle, rested a folded strip of yellowed paper. Against every instinct, I unfolded it. Written across the page in faded ink were 2 names. The first belonged to one of the missing backpackers. The second was mine. Before I could react, another lantern crashed to the ground. Inside was another piece of paper. Sarah unfolded it with trembling hands. Her own name stared back at her. She immediately dropped it and whispered, "We're leaving. Now." We turned and ran, but the orange trailblazers had vanished. Every tree now held only white lanterns, stretching endlessly in every direction. There was no trail anymore, only light. The voices returned, no longer repeating the same sentence. This time they called our names from every side, sometimes sounding like frightened hikers, sometimes like dispatch operators, sometimes like fellow rangers we both knew. Then one voice rose above all the others. It belonged to the district chief. "Sarah," it called calmly, "bring your partner back. We found the hikers." Sarah didn't even hesitate. "He's been dead for 6 years," she whispered. "Don't answer him." The footsteps around us stopped all at once. Complete silence settled over the ridge. Then every lantern in the forest lifted into the air without a single hand touching them. Hundreds of pale lights floated slowly upward until they formed a glowing path, disappearing into the darkness above the treetops. Standing beneath that impossible trail of lanterns were the 3 missing backpackers. They smiled and waved as if nothing had happened. "We're okay," one of them called. "Come with us. It's safe now." Relief almost overcame my fear, until I noticed they weren't standing on the ground. Their boots hung several inches above the leaves, gently swaying as though suspended by invisible strings. Sarah raised her flashlight toward their faces. The beam reached them for only a heartbeat before every lantern in the sky went out simultaneously. Darkness swallowed the ridge. In that single instant before my flashlight failed, I saw what had really been holding the lanterns. Every light was hanging from the hand of a towering figure that stood above the trees, so impossibly tall that its head disappeared into the night sky. It lowered one empty lantern toward us, and from somewhere inside it came the desperate voices of dozens of missing hikers, all whispering the exact same sentence. "Please, don't let them light another one." The lantern door slowly opened by itself, and inside was enough empty space for 2 more names. Story 8. Every Appalachian Park Ranger knows that maps can be wrong. Storms wash out trails, landslides reshape valleys, and fallen trees force hikers to find new routes every season. But there is one map hidden inside the district archives that no ranger is ever allowed to carry into the mountains. It isn't classified, and it isn't locked away because of military secrets. It's locked away because every ranger who tried to follow it either disappeared or came back, insisting the map was drawing itself while they walked. I first heard about it during my 5th year with the National Park Service, after an elderly man wandered into Ranger Station 11, just before closing time, carrying a faded topographic map folded inside a waterproof pouch. He claimed he'd found it nailed to a tree nearly 15 miles from the nearest marked trail. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary survey map, except for one impossible detail. Every official trail was missing. Instead, a single narrow path wound across the page toward a place labeled only Boundary Cabin. There were no coordinates, no elevation marking, and no survey date. Before we could question the man further, he quietly stood up, left the map on the counter, and walked out into the rain. Security cameras showed him exiting the building, but none of the cameras outside ever captured him leaving the parking lot. It was as if he simply disappeared between one doorway and the next. 2 days later, dispatch received an emergency beacon from deep inside the backcountry. The signal belonged to Ranger Ethan Doyle, a veteran with 16 years of wilderness experience who had been inspecting remote bridges before severe weather arrived. His GPS location made no sense. According to every official map, he was transmitting from a section of mountain where no trail had ever existed. His only radio message lasted 5 seconds before dissolving into static. "Don't use the old map. It already knows." Then the transmission ended. My supervisor placed the mysterious map in front of me without saying a word. Across the bottom, someone had written a sentence in faded pencil. "It changes after sunset." Against his better judgment, he assigned me to search for Ethan alongside Senior Ranger Rebecca Hayes, one of the few people who admitted she had seen the map before. During the drive, she refused to unfold it. Instead, she kept it sealed inside the waterproof pouch resting on the dashboard. "If it opens by itself," she said quietly, "don't read what's new." I assumed she was trying to scare me until we reached the trailhead shortly before dusk. The weather forecast called for clear skies. Yet a thick grey fog clung to the valley without moving. We began following Ethan's last known coordinates, but after less than half a mile, every orange trail, blaze disappeared from the trees. The only thing guiding us was the folded map in Rebecca's hands. Then something impossible happened. Without anyone touching it, the waterproof pouch slowly inflated as though air were filling it from the inside. The zipper eased open by itself, and the map unfolded across the forest floor. New black lines began crawling over the paper like wet ink spreading through cloth. A trail that hadn't existed moments earlier slowly drew itself between the contour lines, ending at a tiny square labeled Boundary Cabin. Beside it, another word appeared, letter by letter. Occupied. Rebecca immediately folded the map shut, but the ink continued moving beneath the paper. Neither of us spoke as we followed the direction it had indicated. After nearly an hour, we reached a narrow clearing where an old log cabin stood surrounded by towering hemlocks. It looked abandoned, yet warm yellow light glowed behind its dusty windows. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, even though no footprints crossed the muddy ground around it. Every inch of soil surrounding the cabin was perfectly smooth, untouched by people or animals despite the recent rain. A weathered wooden sign hung above the porch. Most of the paint had peeled away, leaving only 4 readable words. Maps end here. Rebecca slowly backed away. We never found this place, she whispered. Then how are we standing in front of it? She didn't answer. Instead, she stared at the folded map still clutched in her hands. With trembling fingers, she turned it over and showed me the back. A fresh sketch had appeared in dark ink. It wasn't a drawing of the cabin. It was a detailed map of the room we were about to enter, and inside that map, 2 tiny figures stood near the front door, while a third figure waited behind them, even though neither of us had seen anyone inside the cabin. At that exact moment, 3 slow knocks echoed from the other side of the wooden door. He had repeated the sentence with identical pauses between every word, as though he were reading from a recording instead of speaking naturally. Rebecca quietly unfolded the map again. More black lines were spreading across the paper, but this time, they weren't drawing trails. They were drawing the inside of the cabin room by room. A tiny black dot moved slowly across the sketch until it stopped directly behind the front door. Then another dot appeared beside it. Rebecca and I stared at each other. There should have been no one else inside. Before either of us could react, the door slowly creaked open by itself. Warm light spilled across the porch, carrying the comforting smell of burning pine and fresh coffee. Ranger Ethan Doyle sat alone at a wooden table, smiling as though he'd been expecting us all along. He looked exhausted, but completely unharmed. His uniform was clean. His radio rested beside a steaming mug. "About time," he said. "I've been waiting all afternoon." Relief almost overcame my fear, until I noticed the windows behind him. Outside those windows wasn't the forest we had just walked through. Beyond the glass stretched an endless snow-covered landscape beneath a grey sky, even though it was late spring outside. Rebecca didn't step inside. Instead, she slowly asked, "Ethan, what's today's date?" He smiled without hesitation. "September 14th. My blood ran cold. It was May. Ethan's smile never changed. "You're confused because the map hasn't finished with you yet." Suddenly, the folded map in Rebecca's hands became warm. She looked down and gasped. New writing was appearing across the bottom of the page in fresh black ink. Occupants: Ethan Doyle, Rebecca Hayes. A pause followed. Then another line slowly carved itself into the paper. Pending. Occupant. My name. Rebecca immediately threw the map onto the porch, but the ink continued spreading by itself. The tiny drawing of the cabin enlarged until every room became visible in impossible detail. I froze when I noticed 3 figures inside the kitchen. Ethan sat at the table. Rebecca stood beside the doorway. The 3rd figure looked exactly like me, except it was facing the wrong direction. Its body pointed toward the door while its head remained turned completely backward, staring directly out of the page at us. At that exact moment, someone gently knocked on the front door from inside the cabin. 3 slow knocks. Ethan looked toward the hallway with visible confusion. "Did you hear that?" he asked. The knocking came again. This time it echoed from a closed bedroom deeper inside the cabin. Ethan stood up nervously. "There's nobody else here." Before anyone moved, another knock sounded, this one from beneath the wooden floorboards. Then another came from above the ceiling. Within seconds, the entire cabin was surrounded by knocking, every wall answering another, as if dozens of unseen visitors were politely asking to come inside. Ethan's smile disappeared. "It found us," he whispered. Rebecca grabbed my arm and backed away from the porch. "Don't cross the doorway." But I couldn't move. My eyes were fixed on the map lying at my feet. The sketch had changed again. It no longer showed us standing outside the cabin. It showed the porch completely empty. The 3 figures were now all inside. Then the paper folded itself shut without anyone touching it. The cabin lights went out simultaneously. Darkness swallowed every window. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then, through the black glass of the front window, I saw 3 silhouettes standing side by side. Ethan, Rebecca, and me. All 3 slowly raised one hand and waved from inside the cabin. Rebecca was still gripping my arm beside me on the porch. I could feel her trembling. That meant the figure waving through the window wasn't her, and it wasn't me either. Before we could run, the map slid across the porch by itself and opened to one final page. There was no drawing this time, only a handwritten note in faded ink that read, "The cabin doesn't trap people. It traps the version of you that chooses to leave. The real occupants never realize they stayed." Then the cabin vanished without a sound. The clearing was empty. No building, no chimney, no porch beneath our feet. Only an open patch of forest and a weathered survey map nailed to a nearby tree. Across its center, someone had carefully drawn a brand new landmark that had never existed before. Ranger Station 12, occupied